Welcome to Sports Spectrum, the sports and faith podcast that brings Jesus back into the conversation. Here's your host, Jason Romano.
Welcome, everyone, to the Sports Spectrum podcast. I am Jason Romano. Great to have you joining us on the program today. As always, you can reach us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Stitcher, Spotify, everywhere podcasts are found. All of our content, including a daily devotional, of course, can be found at sportspectrum.com, where you can subscribe to our magazine for an unbelievable price right now. $18 gets you a year's edition of the Sports Spectrum magazine, the quarterly magazine, including a bonus issue, plus a couple other special issues, 4, 5, 6 issues that you'll get for just $18 for the entire year. So go to sportspectrum.com and subscribe. I promise you, it's a great magazine. You won't regret it. You will love the Sports Spectrum magazine. Subscribe today over at sportspectrum.com. Today's guest on the podcast is George Taylor. George is the CEO of the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association. That's right, the Rodeo Cowboys Association. Now, this is our first guest that has any affiliation or association with the rodeo. But as I said, and I've said many times on this podcast, we are Sports Spectrum, the spectrum of sports. And so that does not mean it's just NFL or baseball or basketball or hockey or golf. It is the spectrum of sports, everything in the sports world, sports entertainment, sports affiliation with faith. That's really what it's about. And if you've heard this podcast and you've listened to enough of these guests on the podcast, you know that it isn't just about the big name athlete. It is literally about telling great stories on the intersection of sports and faith. And I received an email from a young lady probably about a month ago, maybe a couple months ago, and she was suggesting a guest for the podcast. And as I always mention here, you can suggest any guest you think would be great for our podcast on any level, and we'll consider it. And you can email that to jason@sportspectrum.com, jason@sportspectrum.com. And we're always looking for guest ideas, people that have great stories, high school coaches, kids, different types of sports, you name it. We're open for it. And so George Taylor's name came across on this lady's email to me, and George is the CEO of the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association. And he was just named that CEO to that CEO position in January of 2018. And the Pro Rodeo Cowboys Association is the largest and oldest rodeo sanctioning body in the world. And so I just thought it would be fun to talk to George and just learn about the rodeo. You know, I'm a kid that grew up in the Northeast. There were no rodeos in my little town of Ravenna, New York. There weren't. But I'm fascinated by it, and I thought it would be interesting to kind of just learn about the rodeo. And really, there's a lot of people. I think George might have said this, or I found it on the internet, but over 6 million people attend these rodeos each year. 6 million people. So that's a lot of people, and there's a lot of interest, and it's very entertaining, I'm told, and very family friendly, which is also cool. And there's a lot of connections to faith in the rodeo world. So that's what we talk about with George. So let's get to learn a little more about the rodeo here on the Sports Spectrum podcast with George Taylor, the CEO of Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association, on the Sports Spectrum podcast. Take a listen. George, welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks so much, Jason.
Good to talk to you, George. Let's start from a very bare-bones basic question of what exactly is the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association? Share with us that.
Yeah, just at the highest level, think about it a little bit like you think about the PGA Tour. We're really a sanctioning body that sanctions rodeos and structures them together. We have about 600 rodeos across the country that, over 5,000 cowboys would compete in a variety of events. And we have a world championship that's held every December out in Las Vegas. 10 nights sold out at the Thomas and Mack Center, where Las Vegas really becomes a Western town.
That's awesome. So walk us through what an event is like, kind of how maybe you don't even have the answer to this, but not necessarily how it's put on, but kind of what that atmosphere is like. I know the championship you just mentioned in December, I guess that will be coming up next month as this podcast airs, but just what is it like as they put on an event. I kind of compare it to, I don't know if it would be more like a WWE event wrestling wise, or if it's more like a basketball or even a baseball game or a football game.
Yeah, it's really, a series of events where we have the contestants doing different things, right? So, broadly, we have timed events, which, would be like tie-down roping, where a guy is backed into a box on his horse, and then he chases a animal out and has a tie-down event, if you will, to tie him down, and the speed at which he does that determines his score at the end of the day. And then the other side of it would be stuff we would call rough stock, which would be bronc riding, saddle bronc riding, bareback riding, and bull riding. And that's, kind of your 8-second model where a guy tries to hang on for 8 seconds. But the event itself, the structure of it, much like every one of our sports here in the country, you start off with a national anthem, and the guys are getting ready, and then we run through that series of 7 events. And another unique aspect of it is we have barrel racing, which would include women. So we're probably one of the few sports that also has an element where women are competing at the same time as the men.
We're talking to George Taylor here. He's the CEO of the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association here on the Sports Spectrum podcast. And this is the spectrum of sports, as we like to say. We're intersecting sports and faith, but we're not just an NBA, NFL, MLB show. We want to kind of hear from all the different spectrums of sports, and certainly rodeo is on there. As it's mentioned in the bio, George, that the PRCA is the largest and oldest rodeo sanctioning body in the world. Without giving dates and specifics, give us a sort of overview, maybe Rodeo 101, of the legacy of not only the association, but just of rodeo in general. Because I grew up in the Northeast in New York, and I'm not a rodeo guy. I've never experienced a rodeo, but it sounds amazing. It sounds like I'd have a blast doing it. Can you give us like a Rodeo 101 tutorial on kind of where it originates, kind of how long it's been around, that type of thing?
Yeah, it's been, around a little over, and people might argue this, 80 to 100 years ish. We often like to say that it was America's first extreme sport. Today we have about 43 million people who would identify themselves as fans, and I think I mentioned earlier that we have 600 rodeos across the nation, most of them west of the Mississippi, quite frankly, as you said. And we'll have 6 million people attend those events, and they can be from a small festival, that one of these small western towns have put together, and they really almost serve as a reunion for the town on an annual basis, to our largest. We just were able to form a partnership with Houston on their rodeo, and that rodeo will have about 2.5 million people go through the gates over a 20-day period. Wow. And the economic impact that they drive in Houston at the NRG Center there is about $500 million. So, we have these from very small events to these very large events, all culminating up to our championship. But it really, its foundation and where it came from really was from the ranching community. And as many years ago, when the Cowboys needed to doctor animals, and even today, they would use these skills that they developed, whether it was breaking horses, whether it was catching cattle out in the pastures, those types of things, to really enable the ranching community and what they do. And then we jokingly say sometimes that it was late at night with all the guys sharing a beer, when somebody said, "Hold this beer for a second, I'm going to ride that bull over there." That one is less from the ranching community, but just, kind of the competitive nature of cowboys and people.
Forgive me for a lot of these sort of very basic questions here, but I'm just really intrigued to learn more. Is there with the Cowboys, you said there was 5,000 Cowboys on the 600 rodeos that are put on each year. Is there like a LeBron James of the rodeo circuit? Are there guys that sort of dominate their craft, or is it a fairly even playing field in the sense of competition.
No, they're in almost every event, and it kind of goes in cycles, right? But, if you think about a Tiger Woods or a LeBron James or a Dale Earnhardt, our most current example of that would be Trevor Brazile. And Trevor is involved in the timed event side in tie-down roping and in team roping. And Trevor has won, I believe it's 23 world championships.
Wow.
So he's been a cowboy for a long time and has had amazing success doing what he does and has really built that into a good business for himself and has been rewarded and blessed richly as a result of it.
Talking to George Taylor here from the Pro Rodeo Cowboys Association on the podcast. George, were you a fan of the rodeo? I'm curious how you became the CEO, because in January of 2018, literally just, earlier this year, you were named the CEO of the association. How does that come about? And does that come from a place where you were, a rodeo guy as a kid?
Yeah, exactly. Certainly, I was always intrigued by rodeo, but to call myself a rodeo guy would have been an exaggeration on every count. I had a good friend of mine call me after the job was announced. He said, "George, all that bull riding finally paid off." And, I've never participated in a rodeo, had never really been around it. And when the headhunter had initially called me, I said to her, "Listen, you need to understand that I've only been to 2 rodeos in my life." And at the time, I think neither one of those were sanctioned by our sanctioning organization. So I said, but I'm a business guy. So my career, I had kind of a different career. I graduated from university with a computer science degree and went to what was the Google of our time for sure. At the time I graduated, I started with IBM and was with them for a number of years. And then I was the client executive for IBM for Caterpillar and their global business, and had an opportunity to join Caterpillar. And my last position that I had there as an officer of a Fortune 50 company was their chief marketing officer. So, I retired last summer and kind of wondered what we were going to be doing. And we read a book together, my wife and I did. As part of my responsibility at Caterpillar, I had responsibility for all their sports and entertainment work, and I really grew to love that and be energized around it. And as we read this book, it was written by Bob Bodine, who is a headhunter in sports and entertainment. It's called The Power of Who. You already know everybody you need to know. And there was one statement in there that was really powerful. It said, make sure you do something you love with people you love in a place you love. And, that really, my wife and I said, wouldn't we love to do something in sports and entertainment? And then lo and behold, I think it was within 30 days, I got this phone call about this role here. And we started pursuing it and ended up in January in the seat full time, and it has been amazing, quite frankly.
That's awesome. We're going to listen to a few more stories from the rodeo in a minute, but this is a faith and sports podcast, so I got to ask you about your faith in Christ and where that took shape for you. Kind of tell us your testimony a little bit.
Yeah, sure. I was really fortunate in that while my family they weren't all Christians, we certainly were sensitive to church, and growing up in the Midwest, we attended church regularly, and that was a great foundation. And I met many people that had an impact in my life that, stayed engaged in my life as I went through it. My Sunday school teacher, Roy Getz, was an amazing guy, and Roy always wanted to know how we were doing and stayed in touch with us. But, as we go through our lives, sometimes we have challenges. We make bad decisions. I certainly made some when I was growing up in high school. Our family was struggling a little bit, just in the struggles that many families have in this day and age, and it made me just kind of question a lot of stuff. And I actually met a young lady at my high school who I noticed their family was really different. And what was different about it was how they lived out their faith. And from my perspective, that was kind of the beginning when I made a decision to say, hey, trying to do this on my own and watching how that works in life for people and the people I really admired, their relationship with God was kind of central in their own life. And at that time, prayed, that God would forgive me of those things that I had done and just walk with me on a daily basis to make my life be a better reflection of Him. And that was really kind of where it began. And, I've been trying to get better ever since then. So it's a very high standard, but wow, what a great way to live a life and feel as if you always have a hope, right, that kind of transcends everything we do.
Absolutely. How do you incorporate that faith now into your role today, your current role with the Pro Rodeo Cowboys Association? How does faith play a part of what you do for a living as your job?
Yeah, it's and if I talk about it broadly, because for 2/3 of my career I wasn't in rodeo, it was always about living it and being real. And people see you in every way, shape, and form at your job. And, for me, when I was working for a public company, it was about, sharing truths without being overbearing at the end of the day. There's a great verse that I always used as we were thinking about strategy and thinking about purpose within an organization. And I should be able to tell you the reference. I can't off the top of my head, but it's without a vision, the people perish. And, isn't that what we all need? And isn't it just a truth that we all need to have a purpose, right? And we need to have a vision. And so I would use that, as I talked about strategy with my organizations. And, you got a variety of different feedback. Some people really appreciated that you shared that and the fact that it came from a Bible, you didn't make it up, and other people were critical of it. As it relates to rodeo specifically, one of the great things about rodeo, quite frankly, is the fact that faith is an important part of rodeo. There's a prayer before almost every rodeo. I suspect all of them, but, certainly all the ones I've been at. It's really a cool part of this role to see it come out, and hear the guys talk about it.
George, I talk to a lot of athletes, baseball, football, basketball. They have these sort of chapel services provided to them. NBA players have one before every game. Football players every Sunday or Saturday night. Same with baseball. Does the Pro Rodeo Cowboys Association, or just the rodeos that are put on in general, have chapel services before events? Is there an opportunity for these cowboys to be sort of fed in their faith, maybe a Bible study of sorts?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been a variety of different ones, but, there is what's called Cowboy Church. And, if you get down into Texas, I didn't realize this, there are actually cowboy churches. It's like a denomination. But what you can do on a Sunday morning before the rodeo starts, you can go as an athlete to Cowboy Church. And, it's really for any of the attendees that might be at the rodeo as well. So frequently my wife and I would go to one of those services as well and worship with the Cowboys. It's really a cool thing, actually.
That's awesome. Let's close it with this, George. It's been great talking to you and just having a lot of fun learning about the rodeo. Can you just share with us a fun story, whether it's faith-related or even just something fun that our audience would enjoy that you've experienced in your first year seeing a rodeo, being a part of the Rodeo Association, the Rodeo Cowboys Association? Just share a fun story with us.
Yeah, I think, it's the way the Cowboys are wired is, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And this is less faith related, but all the guys are, not all of them, but most of the guys are, very sensitive to faith if they're not very active in their faith. But this just typifies the competition of a Cowboy. You could be at the World Finals, and you could be going through your events, and let's say there's 2 guys left, and the second to last guy does his run and has a phenomenal time, and he gets done with that event, and he's in the lead now, and there's 1 guy left to go. If that 1 guy's horse pulls up lame and he needs to borrow a horse, that Cowboy who just went would lend him his horse in order to compete. And I think it just says something about the fabric of these guys, and it's really what I've grown to respect for them and how they cheer for each other, how they support each other while they're still competing against each other. So for me, that's been a huge thing. But on the faith front, if I have 1 second left here,
of course,
we had one of our riders, J.R. Vazine, who is a bareback rider. And J.R. on September 22nd had a really tough accident. A horse came over backwards on him when he was competing, and he hasn't been able to walk since that happened. But watching J.R. live his faith and depend on God and really just kind of keep his spirits up as he's going through rehabilitation and counting on God to help him be able to walk again has been absolutely powerful. Wow. And, those kinds of things can really be motivating for us. Sometimes our small problems get in the way of us living our faith, but JR has really demonstrated and walked that in a very unique way. And we'd appreciate everybody's prayers for JR as he goes through his rehabilitation and learns to walk again.
Absolutely. We'll definitely be praying for him. It's interesting. I always think about, it says more about our faith when we face trials than when things are going all great and wonderful, right? I mean, we can always say God is good when we are living that life, but then when things get bad, that's what really tests our character. Have you seen that in the rodeo circuit, not just with JR, but maybe in your own personal life, that it's through the tough times that we're really built up in our faith?
Yeah, isn't it really, it's really, as I've grown older, really learning to live and live my life around Romans 8:28, which is, and we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him and those who have been called according to his purpose. And I think, that us being able to really lay into that when we need it most and be confident that it will all work out has been one of the most exciting things for me personally. Whether it was about when I stopped doing my job that I had before, I had no idea, but I really leaned on that verse, and God really, in my case, in that particular time, blessed it richly. We're really thankful that where we ended up in this whole journey. And I just encourage us all to kind of remember that every day. We're living beyond this world, and we got a God who cares for us. So it's an exciting opportunity for us all.
He is George Taylor, the CEO of the Professional Rodeo Cowboys Association. George, where can people find out more about the rodeo events that might be coming into their area? I know you said the championship is going to be in December in Las Vegas. Is there a website people can go to check it all out?
Yeah, we're on prorodeo.com as you might guess, but that's where our major fan interaction comes from. We also have a presence on Twitter and Instagram if you want to know more about it, that gives people a lot more insight to the sport.
Great. ProRodeo.com. George, it's been great catching up with you and getting to know you and certainly learning more about the rodeo. I really appreciate you joining us, and hopefully we'll meet up someday in person and get to shake your hand. So thanks again for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Jason. I appreciate the opportunity.
Really good stuff, right? George Taylor bringing it from the Pro Rodeo Cowboys Association. Just appreciate George. And that went way better than I could have ever expected. I learned a lot about the rodeo. Looks like they got some great things going on there. And George, just a classy guy, first-class guy. He lives in Colorado Springs, and I'm looking forward to getting out there at the home base of Sports Spectrum in Highlands Ranch, Colorado, and hopefully getting to meet him and shake his hand. Great guy. And let's all make sure we're praying for JR and keeping him in prayer with that accident that George mentioned towards the end of the podcast that he had as he rehabilitates, and hopefully someday gets the ability to go back and be a part of the rodeo. We'll be praying for JR for sure. And thanks to George Taylor for joining us here on the podcast. You can find out, again, more about the Pro Rodeo Cowboys Association over at prorodeo.com. Check it out, prorodeo.com. They're all over the country. So it might be kind of fun to go to a rodeo. Maybe you run into George and tell him you heard this interview on the Sports Spectrum podcast. So thanks to George for joining us. Thanks to you for listening. We value you. We are so grateful that you took the time to spend 30 minutes or so with us and listening to this interview. It means a lot. And listen, our goal here is to share the stories of sports and faith, to point people back to Christ, to glorify God through the stories of the people on the intersection of sports and faith. And so without you listening and telling others, it's great. We're going to tell these stories either way, but you help make this podcast be what it is. And it's been over 450,000 of you have downloaded this podcast. And that's just an amazing testimony, I guess, to what God can do when you say yes to his plan. And so what we'll ask you to do right now is quite simple. Just be praying. Be praying for JR. Be praying for the Pro Rodeo Cowboys Association. Pray for Sports Spectrum. Pray for our ministry. We are a media ministry, so it's kind of a weird a dynamic of being in the media, but also being in ministry. So pray for us. Keep us in prayer. Let us be in your prayer list if that's something that you're willing to do. Just that God will continue to be glorified. We just want to tell these stories and let people know about them, and that's it. So please pray for us. Keep us in your prayers. And as always, if you want to reach us, you can reach us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at sports_spectrum. You can like us, follow us, do all those great things. And you can also reach me directly on email, jason@sportsspectrum.com. And of course, we'll mention again, like we did in the beginning of the episode, subscribe to the Sports Spectrum magazine, $18 for an entire year. It's an incredible deal, and it's going on right now at sportsspectrum.com. Just click that subscribe button and get that magazine. I promise you, you will love the magazine. You really will. Thanks for listening. We appreciate you. Hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll see you next time on a new episode of the Sports Spectrum Podcast.